The following story is true and has been extensively researched based on available eyewitness testimony and official communication from the law enforcement agencies involved. The goal of these videos is to shine a light on individuals and stories long forgotten, the famous and infamous that make up our shared histories.
My thanks to Geno Samuel for the intro. Today we're in Pulaski, Tennessee, at the Maplewood Cemetery, one of the oldest in the county. I've done videos here before, but I'm here today for a very specific reason, a very specific person. And I was beginning to think that I wouldn't find her grave at all. The subject of our video today is that of Emily McKnight Abernathy. Emily, from one of the oldest families in Pulaski, died in 1946 at the age of 30. Growing up in Pulaski, she would attend Giles County High School, where she would also write for the school newspaper. Later, she would come back and teach here. Emily was voted best all-around girl at Bethel College. She was heavily involved in scouting and a volunteer whenever there was a need. And for her, her life's pursuit was to be a librarian. And she tackled it as she did anything in her life with everything she had. She would attend Martin Methodist College, which was then a 2-year university, later a 4-year, where myself and Lori would attend. She would finish up her academic pursuits at the Peabody College, which would later become a part of Vanderbilt University, where she would receive her degree in library studies. For 2 years, as part of a cooperative program from the Peabody College, she would be a librarian in the University of Cincinnati system. And during World War II, she would be the librarian at the Quantico, Virginia Marine Base. So as you can tell, Emily was not someone to just sit on her laurels. She was always looking for that next position that could get her closer to her dream job. She would end up teaching in Spring City, Tennessee, coming back to teach at her alma mater, Giles County, before finally she got the call for the job she had always wanted. To find her grave, I'll have to look amongst thousands, but thankfully, I know where to go. It's in the new section of the cemetery, the 9th row, the 83rd grave. And you may be saying, Aaron, new grave, 1946? Well, when this cemetery has graves that go all the way back to the early 1800s, 1946 is new. I decided to get out of the car, and lo and behold, there she was. Emily Abernathy is buried next to her parents, as well as many of her siblings. But you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone here in Pulaski that has ever heard of Emily Abernathy. But if you go to Bryan, Ohio, that's a completely different story.
Emily Abernathy came to Bryan in 1946 at the invitation of the Newcomer family. She was from Pulaski, Tennessee. She was a trained and educated librarian.
And it was Judge C.L. Newcomer who had invited Emily. He was very impressed with her resume, and being a part of the library board, it was his job to find a new town librarian for Bryan. Finally, Emily had found the position she had always wanted, and she loved how similar Bryan was to her home of Pulaski. Finally, she had her forever job. Emily had moved to Bryan June the 1st of 1946, and by September, things had settled in just as wonderfully as she could have ever hoped. She even had a steady boyfriend, the son of Judge Newcomer himself. It's Thursday, the 19th of September, 1946. Emily Abernathy has arrived at work, and she knows it's going to be a tiring day. It's her turn to do the late shift and lock up the library.
But as the head librarian, she couldn't expect others to do it if she didn't. 4 months into starting her new job and moving from Tennessee, Emily was generally happy with her job, if not feeling a bit tired. The usual tasks lay ahead: managing staff, helping the public, keeping the library organized and tidy, maintaining library catalogs, chasing and collecting books back and enforcing fines, ordering and displaying new stock, maintaining a quiet environment. The list seemed to be never-ending. She took a deep breath and stepped inside the Bryan library to begin her to-do list.
James Robert Engel, a 21-year-old ex-serviceman, he'd found himself at a bit of a loose end since the end of the war. He'd lost his purpose, his drive that the Navy had given him.
Both Janice and I knew Jim because we were in the same class in high school. Jim was tall and quiet.
Jim didn't want to follow his dad into the auto supply store, but now he had nothing to occupy his time with the war being over. Seeing the lights of the library on, he walked inside. Perhaps there would be something to inspire him in there. As Jim walked in, Emily looked up from her desk with a smile. What was it with people always coming in so close to closing? Jim asked to be shown the magazines. Unfortunately, these were kept in the archive in the basement. But as Emily always did, she gladly took him down. She wandered down the stairs to show him the access to the collection. Happy that he could now find what he was looking for, she left him. He flicked through a large stack of magazines. Emily, who had been a reporter for her high school paper, the Pulaskian, had no idea that just a few hours later, her name and picture would find their way onto the front covers of local and national press. Emily's work was more important to her than anything, and she knew she mustn't be careless about locking up the library on time. So just before 8:30 p.m., she headed back down the stairs to tell the gentleman that it was time to go. Emily had won Best All-Around Camper at the Pulaski All-Girls Camp in 1934, but sadly, her helpful and kind nature wouldn't benefit her in any way over the next few minutes. Emily would tell James Robert Engel that it was almost time to close. He turned and grabbed Emily, and she screamed. He pushed her to the floor and beat and kicked her. He would eventually stab her with a penknife 23 times and leave her for dead.
The murder was just particularly brutal. It started out as a beating.
To think about what he did to her. Just a so-called normal person.
After coming back to make sure this horrific deed was done, Jim Robert Engel would leave the library. He headed to a local gas station to wash his hands, and when he looked at himself in the mirror, he said he saw a mad dog. Leaving the gas station, Jim Engel paced around the square, loitered in the alleyway next to the library, finally going over to the Palace Recreation Bowling Alley. At this time, it was in the second story of the Greek Motor Sales building. There's also a local rumor that as the chaos unfolded and police descended on the scene, he calmly sipped a Coke before going home.
Around 11 o'clock, the library clerk, Janice McLennan, noticed that the library lights were still on. This was unlike Emily, and after failing to reach her on the phone, she asked her friend and fellow Michigan native, Wayne Taylor, to come and help her search the library.
And Wayne and Johnny went around to the back, and then they went down the stairs. And then all hell broke loose.
Sadly, upon going down to the basement, they discovered Emily's clearly lifeless body. Janice ran screaming from the building, and Wayne called the police. The crime scene had provided some important clues, a size 11 bloody footprint and a bloody fingerprint. It was a brutal murder, and Emily had fought hard to survive.
In the coming days, this unthinkable crime would not only dominate local news, but national news as well for a time. The pressure was on for local police to name a suspect, and there was even a thought of hiring outside criminologists to assist. Back in Tennessee, Emily's hometown of Pulaski was trying to somehow come to grips with this nightmare. Locals raised $1,000 in hopes that they could find a suspect in this brutal slaying. Further complicating matters for the police was that there was seemingly no motive for the killing whatsoever. The coroner would confirm that Emily had not been sexually assaulted, but her beating had been vicious. Her teeth had been knocked out, eyes blacked. This was the most brutal thing the citizens in Bryan had known for some time. As the investigation continued, Emily's body would be taken by hearse from Bryan back to Pulaski, Tennessee. Accompanying her would be her brother, Richard Abernathy of Nashville, who had been in Bryan since they had found Emily's body, and 75-year-old former judge C.L. Newcomer, library board member, and the man who had hired Emily just a few months before. She would be taken to her home on Jefferson Street, where family and friends would say goodbye, and then finally a service at her hometown church, First United Methodist in Pulaski. They said the crowd was so overflowing that it came outside down the steps, that flowers were seen from all sides. A town was in mourning of a very beloved citizen. Back in Bryan, the police were more determined than ever. As Emily was laid to rest in Maplewood Cemetery back in Pulaski, they wanted to find the killer. And little did they know, they would get their killer very soon.
Police would get a break in the case when grocer Leroy Lamberson said he saw Engel in an alley beside the library the evening that Emily was killed. He greeted Engel, and Engel returned the greeting. This matched the description of a 5'9" man in a blue striped shirt seen near the library at the time of the incident. Police now had their man.
Come on, Jim. Tell me about attacking her. You want to get this off your mind.
Thankfully for police and for the family of Miss Abernathy, Engel was ready to talk. Why had he done it? That's what police were desperate to find out. Why Emily Abernathy? Why then?
Yes, I want to get this off my mind.
At the urging of his parents, who thought that he was mentally ill, and with rosary in hand to hopefully gain some sort of sympathy, Engel would give a shocking full confession about the murder of Miss Emily Abernathy.
I beat her with my fists, strangled her, kicked her. Do you want to see the knife I used?
Did you go out there looking for her?
Yes.
But you had an inclination there that you would like to go with her.
Not go with her. I just had an inclination I wanted to kill her.
Finally, police had their shocking reason for Emily Abernathy's murder. Engel had simply wanted to kill. He claimed that it had been with him his whole time in the service, and he had never been able to do it. He tried to claim he was unable to adjust to life back as a civilian. The police saw no truth to that. His family pushed a mental illness narrative, but in the end, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. During the trial under cross-examination, Engel would say he had actually tried several times over that same day to get the courage up to commit the brutal crime. He would leave the library, come back, and finally on his third attempt, he was able to do the brutal act. Engel's father had said he had hoped his son would come back from the military and find purpose in the family business. But yet he knew there was an evil streak there. He knew there had been cruelty towards animals. But he never imagined his son would do something like this. The former jail where Engel would give his confession in the grisly murder still stands to this day and is said by locals to be a hub of paranormal activity. Armed with the confession, prosecutors had thought the death penalty might be in play. But possible mental issues, including what some today think might have been schizophrenia. And although initially James Robert Engel would serve his time in the state penitentiary, later he would be transferred to a mental facility. And as hard as it is to fathom, in the mid-1970s, he would be released.
James Robert Engel would return to Bryan in the 1980s. He would seemingly flaunt his newfound freedom by standing on the street corner staring at the Bryan Library. Engel's parents would live well into their 90s, and in 2010, at the age of 85, he would die in a nursing home.
It's been nearly 79 years since Emily Abernathy was brutally slain in Bryan, Ohio, just 3 months into her dream job. Many people in Pulaski, Tennessee, as I said at the beginning of this video, are not aware of Emily's story. But Bryan, Ohio has been forever changed by this tragedy. And they've done numerous things to try and remember her legacy as one of service with a smile and appreciation for others.
Bryan was a small, quiet community, much like it is today.
I think anybody who grew up of my age, grew up in Bryan or near Bryan, has heard of the Bryan Library murder.
Events happen yearly around Halloween at the old library, which still stands. Townspeople had talked at the time about the need to tear it down and build a new one in light of the tragedy, but yet it never happened. They made additions to it, but the original library still stands. There's also paranormal events that happen at the old jail where the confession was made. And it was because of those Halloween-themed events that a documentary would be made with all proceeds benefiting the library in 2015. Capture One Studios, in one of their first works as a production company, produced Emily's story, finally shining a light on this story at what was then the 69th anniversary of the murder. Director Christopher Page, writer Matt Ehrman, and an all-volunteer crew, the first people to tell Emily's story in a format other than the newspaper since The Big Story, a television show from 1953, which is now lost media. I'll include a link to Emily's story where it can be purchased on DVD. It's also worth noting about The Big Story. I had hoped that I could find that television show, even though it was really going to be trying to find a needle in a haystack. But the episode from 1953, which was done in conjunction with a reporter from the Tennessean at the time, The Big Story was a news item of the week. They would dramatize some of the top news stories. And apparently what they had done for this story about Emily Abernathy had very much angered the citizens of Bryan. This, of course, had only been less than 10 years, 6-7 years down the road since the murder. And their portrayal, I guess, is not to their liking. Many things were done around the 75th anniversary of the murder. A tree was planted outside of the library, and it has a nice plaque that honors Emily. There was also candlelight vigils held. The 1940s and 50s were still seen as a very innocent time in our country. Yet we had just come back from a major war in World War II, service members trying to rejoin society. And then, just like now, we have run-ins with true monsters. There was nothing that Emily Abernathy could have done differently. She simply did her job, did it to the best of her ability, and she loved what she did for a living. Her whole adult life had been trying to secure the job that she finally had in Bryan. So in the end, we remember her, we acknowledge her life, and we face a reality that we have to always be careful, each and every day, because you never know when it might be your last.